Welcome back to another session. I hope you are well. In today's session, I would like to talk about resistance. Now, the sessions that I covered previously, the last two sessions, I began the process of introducing laws into the concept and into our discussion about depression. I made reference to the fact that there are certain laws that govern the universe, some of which we call scientific laws and others we call natural laws or laws of nature. In any case, whether scientific or natural, the laws of the universe are built into the very existence of life. Our knowledge of said laws or our ignorance of said laws does not does not negate the working principles of the laws. The law is always working. As a matter of fact, the laws are no respecter of persons. The law doesn't care whether you're white or black, tall or short, rich or poor. The law simply says and expects one and only one thing from you, which is understand the law and apply the law in the right way. It doesn't ask you not to apply the law in the wrong way. The application is all the law needs to provide outputs, outcomes, and results. But the way we are designed and the way we are created and the way we've come about has been with a purpose in mind, and that purpose only achieves and reaches its full potential when we work with the laws rather than work against the laws. So I started talking about the law of attraction and how there is a secondary law supporting and undergirding the law of attraction, and that is the law of vibration. I made reference to the fact that you can change your psychological, physical, mental state by moving to a different frequency, a different vibration, a different energy state, and shifting the depression you might be suffering and moving away from depression. Let me place another layer on the whole concept of laws by introducing in today's session the law of resistance, or resistance, as most people generally call it. Um, there is a saying that whatever you resist will persist. And even without thinking about that concept too deeply, um, there is a natural tendency for when a force comes against we as individuals or something around us we care about, whether that be something we've made or created, or something we've birthed, or something that we have nurtured, both in thought or feeling or tangible objects. When there is a push against who we are, we tend to find that the natural process that comes to our hearts, the instinct that comes to us, is we have to resist. So if you imagine that I had placed one part of, and I said to you, place one of your hands out, and I just brought mine next to yours and I started to push yours back. The natural inclination, well, let me speak to myself and about myself. My natural inclination is to push back. Something is pushing against you, you push back because you're trying to counterbalance what perhaps you consider to be an uninvited force. And therefore, the instinct that I've always had is resist. That works because everything has a purpose. There are times to resist, but the natural and the recommended approach is not always to resist. It's best to allow the resistance to flow to you and through you. Sometimes, think about it this way, if you were to go and stand in a body of water and the water is flowing, and there is some velocity to the water. Imagine if you were stood there and you had, let's say, an object that could block off the entirety of you might say, the pathway of the water. As you start to obstruct the flow of the water, the pressure builds on that obstruction. You've placed a significant obstruction. The pressure on you increases with every second that goes past. And part of the reason is because the quantity of water, the energy, the flow, the resonance starts to build. You have molecules upon molecules compounding, and you just have yourself. And eventually, one or two things happen. Something breaks. Either you break or the object breaks. In any case, you cannot go against nature or against the laws. It's the same reason why, and if you stood there and let's assume you built a formidable dam with a huge dam wall, eventually the water will build up. It would either go through, it would go around, it would go over, it would go underneath, but it will go forward. And so what we have to understand is, in dealing with depression and in dealing with the issues that cause us to be in a state where we feel depressed, there is a sense that you might be resisting the inevitable. I'll use a good example. I've lost loved ones, and one of the first experiences when you lose a loved one is denial. Denial can be very powerful. And even when you've seen it in the physical, there is that sense that there will be a miracle that occurs where the person will be raised from the dead. In your case, it might not be the physical loss of a loved one. It could be just the emotional loss, the feeling that the person will return. And I found whenever I resisted, the pain increased, the suffering increased, the longevity, the consistency, the frequency of the pain and suffering magnified greatly. Resistance is a law. And if you don't understand the law of resistance, you'll be choosing battles where there are no rewards. Remember, there is no reward in regards to resistance, especially with regards to natural laws. There are certain things that happen in life. You fail an exam, you get divorced, you lose a loved one, you get into an accident, and more. You must accept, firstly, and I think the process of understanding how to overcome resistance is acceptance. Now, I will talk about the law of acceptance in sessions to follow, but you have to recognize that whatever you're resisting, sometimes the force is just the messenger coming to you. Sometimes it's a force that bears too heavily on the cross that you are carrying. I made reference to how perhaps sometimes our suffering is not by virtue of the yoke we are carrying, but by the resistance we apply to the activity we should be engaged in, and therefore the yoke seems too heavy. The saying, and I believe it, the universe says to each and every one of us, my burden is not too heavy for you. And if the burden you are carrying is too heavy, then it is not the yoke given to you by the universe. Most of us have a heavier yoke, and we suffer longer, and we suffer depression because we are resistant. You have to accept. And part of the acceptance comes by virtue of the fact that perhaps there is a cross, there is a hill you have to go up, and there is some level of suffering that you might have to endure, and the suffering has not come to stay. And whatever does not kill you makes you stronger. But the strength that comes from the experience is only made known to you post the experience. I've said this in sessions prior. In life, you're going to have good times, and you are going to have, let's say, trying times. When you go through each, at the moment you are going through that experience, it is often very hard to identify which is which. It often considers and takes hindsight to look backwards and realize that what may have been an interesting exciting experience at the time. In the moment, you enjoyed it, but in the long term, it was horrible. And similarly, whenever you went through a character building phase, in the moment, it felt like the world was going to come to an end. But in hindsight, you realize that you were just simply building emotional muscles, mental muscles, and it was a training ground for your ultimate purpose. You see, if where you are, or whatever experience you're going through, is not your place of purpose, then it has to be the preparation ground, the training ground for your purpose. And therefore, rather than assign an emotion, a sense, wear a label of depression and anxiety, just see the experience as a character building phase, a phase that allows you to prepare for the main draw. Like boxers, you have training in the gym and preparation for months in advance, and then you then have the main fight. A lot of the work is done during the preparation. We hear about this, proper prior planning prevents poor performance. And most people don't understand the 6 Ps of life. And so what they tend to think is that whenever there is a preparation or a training phase that pushes against them, that it's an indication that everything is wrong. It isn't. Don't resist. What you have to do is learn how not to take life too seriously. Now, not the most welcoming of things to hear someone saying, well, don't take life too seriously. But I would recommend get a piece of paper, write on the piece of paper those words, do not take life too seriously. Laugh a little, laugh a lot. The point of that is, if you can laugh at yourself, then you take the power from the resistance and you put it back in yourself. So for example, you take a test and you fail the test, and it's made known to your peer group that you failed the test that everyone passed. You feel ashamed. You feel as though you're incompetent. People are making jokes about you and laughing at you. At that point, if you resist, what tends to happen, especially within peer groups, we bond with other people by name calling and jokes. And from a masculine perspective, one of the things I would say is, I remember being young, and you come into a space with new people who you'd never met before, and someone calls you, let's say, Johnny Big Hands, and everyone laughs. And then you come the next day and they say, well, Johnny Big Hands has arrived again. And you say, well, my name is not Johnny Big Hands, my name is John. And you're upset because you feel as though you're being disrespected. And then you resist. And the more they see you resisting, the more they intensify that. They put another adjective to what they call you, and they make fun of you. But in many ways, what I learned as a young boy, which is sometimes men use jokes as a way of bonding with other people. And one of the fascinating things I learned, took me a long time, but one of the fascinating things I learned was, if I accepted and I embraced the joke, I didn't resist. I simply accepted. And I even laughed at myself, and I laughed with them. I found the name calling stopped the next day, immediately, because what people had noticed was that they're able to play with you and you not take yourself too seriously. And therefore, it was like a way of vetting the rites of passage. Let's see if he can join us. We want people who we can play with. And one of the ways from a social perspective we understand groups is how they eat together, how they play together, how they work together, and actually how they mourn together. And I had to learn how, and I'm still learning, I do a very poor job at it. Don't take yourself too seriously. Laugh a little. Make jokes out of your situation. Sometimes take yourself out of the picture and speak as though it's a third party, and even tease yourself. And in doing so, what you find actually is that the suffering and the pain although it remains, your focus is changed. Pain is simply a messenger. The resistance is a messenger. And whenever you react, the pain, the experience, the external stimuli, whatever it might be, is in control. If I do something to you and you react, I'm in control because I'm causing you to do something perhaps you otherwise may not have done. If I do something to you and you respond, you are in control. Now, the difference between those two is not just a matter of semantics or definitions. When we react, we tend to do so out of habits and paradigms. We're conditioned to react. When we respond, we do so from our intellect and by thinking, critical thinking. So, for example, think about this. I walk down the street and let me use a controversial one, one that perhaps people may relate to. And I've often found it fascinating when I see other people who share my ethnic image and how they react to this. Let's assume I walk down the streets of London and someone, and this is an example, it has never happened to me, but let's just assume someone called me a word that is associated with my ethnic image, whatever that word might be, and a word that most people see as perhaps unkind, perhaps prejudiced, and even perhaps racist, whatever it might be, the worst of the worst. Let's just call it the N word, for example, because that evokes an emotional reaction more across the side of the pond than over here, but let's just use that for the time being. I have found that in observing how people react to this word, people's instincts is to react immediately. They throw away all emotional control, they throw away the use of their intellectual faculties, and they simply react. So someone calls me an N-word, I can either blow up or I can simply process what has been said through my intellect. Very easy. I go into my reasoning faculty and I start to ask simple questions. Someone says you're an idiot or you're a fool. And I just simply ask myself a question. Am I an idiot? Well, maybe not. I've done things properly. People I interact with will say, perhaps, maybe I have some competence. And by logically going through that question and answer process, you come to a conclusion, which is, no, they're wrong. Their perception is also wrong. And therefore I can respond by saying, well, God bless you, or I think you're wrong, or just I walk away. The difference is that by responding, I'm in control. By reacting, they are in control. It is part of the reason why, if you think about some of the classic movies, whenever they were looking to take down an opponent, they went for people who had emotional, you might say, trigger points. And either someone was hot-tempered. The classic examples would be perhaps what we call the 7 deadly sins, the vices. Someone who had so much gluttony or lust, someone who had avarice, someone who was hot-tempered, or someone who was lustful, or any of the above. And because people could not control a desire that they had, it served as a pathway for setting traps to get them. So you walk into a bar and someone at the bar says something to you and you are about to get into a fight because a word was said. No, they've simply triggered you. They've said something to get a reaction from you, and foolish as you may be, you are reacting to the external wishes. It is the same thing that happens with life and the events that occur around and to us and through us. We have to learn how to respond. And resistance. If you resist, you're reacting. If you accept, you're responding. And think about the whole analogy I was using, though poorly, of standing, say, in a pond of water or river that flows, and you have this barrier you're holding up this barrier alone, and you're building up this, volume of water that wants to keep moving. And eventually, you get hurt. Whereas if you stood in the same body of water and you simply alter the angle rather than stay face, perpendicular to the direction of travel, and blocking the flow, you just allow yourself to perhaps position yourself at a slight angle. What you find is that the water just flows. It's as though water is falling off a duck's back. It just bounces off you and it moves on. And that's the same pattern and manner that you should deal with life. Think of yourself as a martial artist. Now, I can speak to this because I perhaps have some experience. And after many, many years of practicing and competing nationally, internationally, at the world stage, eventually the body keeps the score. And you realize, well, it's not that you're getting old, although that matters. It's more so that you've taken too much beatings, and because it's just a hard groove sport. It's part of the reason why boxing and certain martial arts, you can't do it for a long time, especially at a competitive rate. Whereas if you move to something like jiu-jitsu or judo, or what's it called, aikido, these are forms of martial arts that are not based on brute force. In Shotokan karate, we would do the same punches hundreds of times, and we would exert our bodies, the same kicks, different variations of kicks, and it was all about power. You had timing, you had speed, but it was about power. And there was so much contact that takes place. You break this, you break that, you break that. But eventually, after my body couldn't take that much beating, I transitioned. I had to say, well, I have to transition and move to something that I can do without killing myself. And that could be, in my case, it was jiu-jitsu or wrestling or grappling. And that allows you to, play the game of chess more intelligently. It's not about the survival of the fittest. It's about outwitting your opponent. And so I would say in the same way, think about your depression as a game, a martial arts, a competition. You want to outlast the experience, the emotion. And you simply don't resist it, let it flow to you. Take the message. Remember, there is a message hidden in how you feel. Accept the message. Ask the simple question, what is the message and what is the messenger saying to me? If I'm anxious, what is it saying? I'm anxious about something. If I'm fearful, what is the message? What am I fearful about? If I have worry and doubt, what is it signaling to me? And the key thing is to understand that you have to disassociate with the need to be stubborn with life and nature and events. Things happen, fine. You roll with the punches. The best boxers and the ones who had the most fruitful careers long term were not the ones who could stand and trade punches. They were the ones who could hit and evade being hit. Protect your head. Depression is an attack, punches being thrown at you constantly. You have to learn how to, firstly, rather than resist, develop the ability to deflect, and then learn how to substitute. Because by deflecting, you simply is the same as just opening up the barrier to an angle and let the water flow, let the energy flow. It's come to you, but it flows away from you. Now you can even harness some of that energy to your advantage. And then the next stage is to substitute the dominant emotion you might have, having taken the lesson, and use that dominant emotion for something positive. The mind is always moving to a thought or moving away from a thought. Resistance occurs when we try too hard. This is part of the reason why, and I could be wrong here because I know there are several versions of yoga and there are people who practice it in a different manner. But I remember going to yoga classes and people would say, well, just sit there quietly and don't think of anything. And I used to think, well, I'm doing something wrong here because I cannot not think of something. And I found, interestingly, the way I was able to develop the ability to try was when they would play some instruments and play some gongs and the om sound. And that moved my thought process from what happened 2 hours earlier, or the prior week, or the prior month, or what I was intending to do the next day. And I focused on that sound, and that sound had emptiness. So we're either moving towards a thought or we're moving away from a thought. And so it's part of the process of minimizing the resistance. You have to learn how to deflect and substitute. The law of resistance is always working. If you're suffering from depression, there is a strong possibility. Now, this might not be you, but there is a strong possibility, part of the issue. And the reason it's lingered for longer than it should have is because you are resisting. The law of resistance is working in your personal circumstances. Learn how it works and use it to your advantage. Now, I hope today's session has been useful.